In this lecture, I'm going to talk about lament psalms that contain harsh petitions that are directed against the enemies. And one such psalm is 109. The psalmist begins with trust, my God, whom I praise. And the petition, do not remain silent. And the complaint, for people who are wicked and deceitful have opened their mouths against me. They have spoken against me with lying tongues. With words of hatred, they surround me. They attack me without cause. And in return for my friendship, they accuse me. But I am a person of prayer. They repay me evil for good and hatred for my friendship. And then comes the petition. Appoint someone evil to oppose my enemy. Let my accuser stand at his right hand. When he is tried, let him be found guilty, and may his prayers condemn him. May his days be few. May another take his place of leadership. May his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. May his children be wandering beggars. May they be driven from their ruined homes. May a creditor seize all of them. May strangers plunder the fruits of his labor. May no one extend kindness to him or take pity on his fatherless children. May his descendants be cut off, their names blotted out from the next generation. May the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord. May the sin of his mother never be blotted out. May their sins always remain before the Lord, that he may blot out their name from the earth. For he never thought of doing a kindness, but hounded to death the poor and the needy and the brokenhearted. He loved to pronounce a curse. May it come back on him. He found no pleasure in blessing. May it be far from him. He wore cursing as his garment. It entered into his body like water, into his bones like oil. May it be like a cloak wrapped about him, like a belt tied forever around him. May this be the Lord's payment to my accusers, to those who speak evil of me. But you, sovereign Lord, help me for your name's sake. Out of the goodness of your love, deliver me. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is wounded within me. I fade away like an evening shadow. I'm shaken off like a locust. My knees give way from fasting. My body is thin and gaunt. I am an object of scorn to my accusers. When they see me, they shake their heads. Help me, Lord, my God. Save me according to your unfailing love. Let them know that it is your hand, that you, Lord, have done it. While they curse, may you bless. May those who attack me be put to shame. But may your servant rejoice. May my accusers be clothed with disgrace and wrapped in shame as in a cloak. And with my mouth I will greatly extol the Lord. In the great throng of worshipers I will praise him. For he stands at the right hand of the needy to save their lives from those who would condemn them. Now, it's the words of the petition in verses 6 through 15 and those throughout verses 16 through 20 that they tend to shock our sensibilities. Now, Jesus said that we are to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. And we assume that what is meant by praying for our persecutors is not this kind of prayer that seeks that the enemies be found guilty in court, that they have their lives cut short, that they lose their position of leadership, and they experience financial collapse, and that their children be orphans and become homeless beggars. So how are we both to understand and apply these psalms into the prayer life and worship of the contemporary church? Now, these petitions there in Psalm 109 are an example of what is referred to as imprecations. Now, imprecations is another term for a spoken curse in the sense of calling down harm on a person. And in Old Testament scholarship, the term imprecation is used of those passages in the Psalms where the psalmist petitioned God to bring harmful judgment upon the enemies. Now, the forms of imprecations occur in about 40% of the Lament Psalms, and there are also a few other occurrences in other genres of the Psalms as well. And imprecations are also found within the book of Lamentations. But now the imprecations in all of these cases are one of the three components in the genre of lament psalms, along with the complaint and the statements of trust and confidence. Those are the three key components. And then also there's the secondary component of affirmation to praise, which makes up the lament psalms. And all of these imprecations are found within the petition component of the lament psalms. And since imprecations are an element of the petition component of the lament psalms, it's not really correct to refer to imprecatory psalms as if there is a distinct genre from the lament psalms. Rather, more precisely, we are speaking about imprecations in the psalms, and even more precisely, imprecatory petitions within the lament psalms. Now, there are several different kinds of imprecatory petitions. First, there are the generic requests for God to intervene against the enemies and to repay them for their actions. In other words, some of the imprecatory petitions are expressed in very broad, general terms, and in just a very general way state what the psalmist expects God to do, both to intervene and to deliver. For example, Psalm 17:13, rise up, Lord, confront them, bring them down with your sword, rescue me from the wicked. Or Psalm 143:12, in your unfailing love, silence my enemies, destroy all my foes, for I am your servant. And other of the imprecatory petitions, in a very general way, request that God repay the enemies for what they have done. In other words, the psalmist petitioned that the enemies would receive their just due based upon what they have done. And often there is a sense of poetic justice in that the evil that the enemy has done or is planning to do to the psalmist is requested to come back and fall on the enemies themselves. For example, Psalm 28:4, repay them for their deeds and for their evil work. Repay them for what their hands have done and bring back on them what they deserve. Now, those kinds of very generalized statements come across as fairly mild expressions of judgment. And thus they tend not to offend our sensitivities too much. But some of the imprecatory petitions move beyond simply this generalized, non-specific statement of judgment to actually specify the desired actions. And some of these are actually extended lists of multiple and diverse specific actions that the psalmist petitioned God to do against the enemies, such as we read there in Psalm 109. But another example of this kind of list of specific actions is Psalm 35. Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take up shield and armor. Arise and come to my aid. Brandish spear and javelin against those who pursue me. Say to me, I am your salvation. May those who seek my life be disgraced and put to shame. May those who plot my ruin be turned back in dismay. May they be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. May their path be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. Since they hide their net for me without cause, and without cause dug a pit for me, may ruin overtake them by surprise. May the net that they have hid entangle them. May they fall into the pit to their ruin. And another example is Psalm 140, verses 8 through 11. Do not grant the wicked their desires, Lord, and do not let their plans succeed. Those who surround me proudly rear their heads. May the mischiefs of their lips engulf them. May burning coals fall on them. May they be thrown into the fire, into miry pits, never to rise. May slanders not be established in the land. May disaster hunt down the violence. Now, in those cases of multiple specified imprecations, they're kind of disturbing to our sensibilities. And this language seems to be very strong, and it even seems like it may be filled with bitterness and malice. So it is these extended lists that often cause us the most consternation as we question, how can the psalmist pray those things? How can the psalmist seem so vicious toward their enemies? And it is these extended imprecatory petitions that raise the questions of how properly to understand and how to interpret these requests. And they raise the harder application questions about the ongoing use of these psalms within a contemporary context. So as to adequately understand the imprecations, the first step is to properly understand them in their original context, and then move to deal with the issue of the contemporary validation. And I believe that the imprecatory petitions need to be read and interpreted in 5 different contexts. The first is that of the literary context. We've already noted that the imprecations occur primarily first in the context of Lament Psalms. And thus, as part of Lament Psalms, the imprecatory petitions reflect an emotional character of outcry that is characteristic of the genre of lament. That the imprecations are not detached theological reflections arising out of studied contemplation of how evil should be dealt with by God. Rather, these imprecatory petitions are the emotion-laden appeals to God arising out of the intensity of the suffering that the psalmist is experiencing. The other aspect of the literary content is that the imprecatory elements are specifically part of the petition portion of the Lament Psalms, in which the psalmists are requesting of God what they would like God to do. They are expressing what they would like God to do so as to alleviate the situation of distress. And so within the context of Lament Psalms, these are petitions expressed to God. They are prayers addressed to God. They are voiced to God. They are not curses that are directly spoken to the enemies. A second context that we need then to read these in is that of the context of prayer, as we said, being addressed to God. Now, within the context of prayer, the imprecatory petitions are part of the dialogue type conversation with God, which is assumed within the context of prayer. Whereas the psalmists make the request to God, most often within the Psalms themselves, a response from God is not given. In other words, there is no divine word saying what God will do, nor do the psalmists give a record of what action God subsequently took. So we do not know exactly what God's response was to each of these imprecatory petitions, whether God's response was that of granting the request or denying it or modifying it in some way. Now, in the component of trust and confidence, the psalmist does feel assured that God will hear and that God will in some way act on their behalf in protection and deliverance. But as to exactly how God will respond, again, it is unstated in this record of the communication event. Again, the psalmist's only record is the psalmist's part of the conversation. But as part of the prayer communication event, every imprecatory petition seems to imply an attached "your will be done," meaning that the matter is left up to God as to how he will respond. And thus within the prayer itself, the requests are left fully in God's hands to deal with the petitions as he wishes. And any act of judgment or punishment or retribution or vengeance against the enemy is also likewise left in the hand of God to execute. Only in one psalm does the psalmist assume that they may be the instrument used by God to execute the imprecation in real life. And that is in Psalm 41:10, where the petition is that God would grant the psalmist the ability to repay the enemies. It says, "But may you have mercy on me, Lord. Raise me up that I may repay them." But even there, the way that repayment is envisioned as happening is not explicitly stated. And the context of that petition is that the psalmist is afflicted with sickness, and those around him are declaring that he will assuredly die, and they are abandoning him because the enemies do not feel that God is present with him. And that context suggests that the psalmist repayment, which he is praying for, may actually be God's healing and keeping the psalmist alive. And thus the psalmist repays the enemies by the psalmist not dying, and thus proving that the enemy's words are false. So even in Psalm 41, the repayment that is prayed for may not involve any action taken directly against the enemies. It may simply be, again, that the psalmist's life is preserved and becomes a testimony or witness against the enemies. But as we noted, in every other psalm, with the exception of Psalm 41, the whole imprecatory petition leaves the matter of whether God will answer the petition as requested, leaves it in God's hands, as well as it leaves the manner in which the petitions are dealt with or will be carried out. That too is left fully in God's hands. So we do need to take into consideration this communication event and the dialogue of prayer and the assumptions related to prayer in which these imprecatory petitions occur. The third context is that of the broader theological context of the covenant between God and his people in the Old Testament. That the Lament Psalms and their petitions arise out of the covenant relationship, and they assume that the covenant obligations and commands are binding upon the people. The Lament Psalms are also based on the expectations and theological presuppositions of the covenant, both with respect to what God requires in that covenant relationship, as well as how God will act within the covenant relationship in response to the people's obedience or disobedience. So because it is based on the covenant relationship, we need to recognize that the covenant demands loving treatment of one's personal enemies. That loving one's neighbor and one's enemy is expressed in the covenant as an obligation. In Leviticus 19, verses 17 and 18, do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. The one was expected and required to love their enemy and to deal with one's enemy in a very gracious and loving manner. Proverbs 25:21. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. And in fact, in the very Psalms that contain imprecations, the psalmists speak about their gracious behavior toward their enemies. Just one example, Psalm 109, verses 4 and 5. In return for my love, they accuse me, even though I pray for them. They place upon me evil for good and hatred in return for my love. So since love of enemies was expected within an Old Testament covenant context, the issue becomes as to how to reconcile that covenant obligation with the harsh judgment words that we find in the imprecatory petitions. Which leads us to a second aspect of the covenant context. When the covenant obligations or commandments were violated, it is delineated that there was to be just and justifiable retribution upon the perpetrator. That appropriate retribution for violations of the covenant applied both to the human relationships with each other as well as in the people's relationship with God. That when one human did an offense against another human, the cases were to be adjudicated with fairness and justice so as to determine the guilty party, so as to exact a just punishment, a punishment that was equal to the crime committed. And that principle of retribution is referred to as lex talionis, an eye for an eye. In other words, the punishment was to equal the crime. Similarly, when God's people violated the relationship with God, God as the covenant overlord or suzerain was considered to be a God of justice who would execute the appropriate retribution. And within the Lament Psalms, we find a lot of judicial and legal language and imagery. And that judicial imagery does place the imprecatory petitions within the context of asking God for a just punishment against those who have done wrong. But also within the covenant is the other side of the coin. The covenant blessings stipulate that covenant obedience would be recorded. Since blessings for obedience was expected, the psalmists declare their faithfulness to the covenant, and they do so in the component of the protestations of innocence within the Lament Psalms that we talked about in the previous lecture. And the psalmist's assertions of their loyalty to God do serve as a motivation based on the covenant for God to deliver. And simply note how in Psalm 25, the emphasis on the covenant and the appeal to the covenant, as well as the petitions of the psalmist to be taught in the covenant way of living, how those things are coupled directly with the petition in verse 2, the petition for God to prevent the enemies from triumphing over the psalmist. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come upon those who are treacherous without cause. Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me. For you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in their ways. He guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. All of the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his covenant. Who then are those who fear the Lord? He will instruct them in the ways that they should choose. They will spend their days in prosperity, and their descendants will inherit the land. The Lord confides in those who fear him. He makes his covenant known to them. My eyes are ever on the Lord, for only he will release my feet from the snare. You can see how the psalmist is appealing to that covenant aspect, that God will reward those who are obedient to the covenant. So both the psalmist's deliverance, request for deliverance or their vindication, as well as the retribution or the punishment coming on the enemies, both of them are based on the covenant concepts of curses for disobedience and blessings for obedience. A fourth aspect of the covenant context is the here and nowness of both the punishments and the blessings. Now, in light of the progressive revelation that we have within the New Testament, we have moved most judgment and retribution off to life after death and to the eschatological future, in which the righteous will be justly rewarded and the wicked will be duly punished. And because of that, immediate earthly punishment and blessing are not nearly as viewed as being nearly as essential. But in the Old Testament period, given the amount of revelation that they had at that time about life after death, they didn't have the theological option of pushing the blessings and punishments off into the afterlife. No, from their perspective, based on the amount of revelation that they had, when justice was executed both as rewards and punishments, it was thought of as a necessary occurrence that would happen right here and right now in this life. As such, the blessings and punishments are thought of in more immediate material ways. And this is very evident as you would read the covenant blessings and curses as found in Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28, and also in Leviticus chapter 26. That if God was going to bless, you would experience it in this life through prosperity and wealth, through increase in material possessions, through longevity of life, through victory over the enemies, through economic and social success. Similarly, with the punishments, you would experience poverty, lack of descendants, having your life cut short, suffering social and economic distress and hardship, or being overcome by your enemies. And that here and nowness, or this life orientation, That perspective clearly shapes the punishments as requested in the imprecatory petitions against the enemies. The things that are petitioned for all reference matters of earthly living, and they are requested to happen in the very immediate future. But there's also a fifth covenant context aspect that we need to note. And that is the content of the specific actions asked for in the imprecatory petitions often correspond directly to the curses or the punishments for violating the covenant that are actually prescribed in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. Now on this chart, you can see the correspondence of the two, that several of the imprecations echo the very punishments that God said that he would execute against those who broke the covenant commands, such as a request for death or shame or confusion or being pursued by God. In other words, the psalmists are not just thinking up in their minds the worst things that they could imagine that they wanted to happen to their enemies. Rather, as they voice these imprecations, they are drawing directly on the punishments that God declared would happen to those who violated the covenant. That the imprecatory petitions draw upon the punishments that are explicitly stated in the covenant documents. So we see that the broader theological context of the covenant does play a very significant part in the specific content and perception of what is requested in the imprecatory petitions. A fourth context in which we need to read the imprecations is that of the specific situational context of disorientation, the context that elicit these imprecatory petitions. And that context is ascertained from the Lament Psalms themselves as they describe and speak about the circumstances. And the circumstances are specifically described primarily in the complaint sections. Now, although these situational aspects that I'm going to talk about are evident in the majority of the Lament Psalms, we're going to illustrate them through just one psalm, that of Psalm 69. The first situational context that is evident is that the psalmists feel that their life is threatened by these enemies, and thus the psalmists plead with God for deliverance. The enemy's threats have resulted in debilitating emotional distress for the psalmist. And with respect to the communal lament psalms, and also in the book of Lamentations, in which the imprecations are directed against the enemy nations, the context is that the nation of Israel or Judah has already been devastated and the population decimated due to the enemy's invasion of the land. And in the individual lament psalms, the actions of the enemies are not minor misdemeanors, or they are not inconveniences being perpetrated against the psalmist. No, they are talked of in terms of being major, potentially violent and life-threatening crimes. The enemies are said to be acting out of hatred toward the psalmists, and thus the psalmists fear for their lives. And the psalmists express that if God does not deliver them, they will end up dying. So, for example, in Psalm 69, the plea, the petition, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold. I've come into the deep waters. The floods engulf me. I am worn out, calling for help. My throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for my God. Those who hate me without reason outnumber the hairs of my head. Many are my enemies without cause, those who seek to destroy me. But I pray to you, Lord, in the time of your favor. In your great love, O God, answer me with your sure salvation. Rescue me from the mire. Do not let me sink. Deliver me from those who hate me, from the deep waters. Do not let the flood waters engulf me, or the depths swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. Answer me, Lord, out of the goodness of your love. In your great mercy, turn to me. Do not hide your face from your servant. Answer me quickly, for I am in trouble. Come near and rescue me. Deliver me because of my foes. There's a sense of urgency on the part of the psalmist as they petition God for deliverance, because one aspect of that situational context is that the psalmists feel that their life is threatened by the enemies. I think that one of the reasons at times it is hard for us to relate to these imprecations, a reason is that we have not been in situational contexts like those of the psalmist, where our very lives are actually being threatened. If you were in a situation like so many were in Nazi Europe, being in the death camps, or experiencing forced labor and imminent extermination, what would your prayer be for your oppressors? What would your prayer be for Hitler? What would you like to see happen to Hitler? Or if you were in the midst of a war-torn nation under constant siege and bombings, and you were daily huddled in the ruins of a bombed-out building, what would you pray to happen to those dropping the bombs? Or what if you were in a position of being repeatedly sexually abused by a family member? How would you pray about your abuser? And I think those kinds of situations are more comparable to what the psalmists were experiencing, as opposed to the inconveniences and oftentimes the minor setbacks that we experience in our lives. So in their distressing situation of being threatened and attacked, the psalmist prayed for deliverance. And they saw deliverance coming from God, through God, in the form of eliminating the ones causing their suffering. But apparently the psalmist saw no other way for deliverance to occur other than the utter elimination of the enemies. So that is what they petitioned for God to do. A second aspect of the situational context is that the enemies are viewed as also being enemies against God. They are not merely the psalmist's personal antagonists. The enemies are described as evildoers. They are hostile. They are deceitful persons. They are people who mistreat the vulnerable. And how they are treating the psalmist is how they treat others. And the way that they are treating human beings is because of their rebelliousness against God. The descriptions of the enemies clearly position them as being wicked rather than righteous. And such description must not be viewed as the psalmist making false accusations against their enemies, nor should it be viewed as an exaggerated negative assessment of the enemies so as to rhetorically bolster the psalmist's argument. No, they should not be viewed that way. Rather, they should be viewed as real, accurate assessments of the enemies. And thus in Psalm 69, you know how I am scorned and disgraced and shamed. All my enemies are before me. Scorn has broken my heart and has left me helpless. I looked for sympathy, but there was none, for comforters, but I found none. They put gall in my food and give me vinegar for my drink. May the table set before them become a snare. May it become retribution and a trap. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Pour out your wrath on them. Let your fierce anger overtake them. Let their place be deserted. Let there be no one to dwell in their tents. For they persecute those you wound and talk about the pain of those you hurt. Charge them with crime upon crime. Do not let them share in your salvation. May they be blotted out of the book of life and not be listed with the righteous. But given who the enemies are, the psalmist call for God to repay the enemies for what they have done. The psalmist call for retribution to come on their enemies for the crimes that the enemies have committed. In contrast to the portrayal of the enemies, the psalmists often view themselves as innocent or righteous sufferers seeking vindication. Again, in the previous lecture, we spoke about protestations of innocence, that in some of the psalms that have the imprecatory petitions, there are also these assertions or protestations of innocence as well. And in those psalms, the threats to the psalmist by the enemies are thus seen as being unprovoked and without cause, as in Psalm 69. For I endure scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. When I weep and fast, I must endure scorn. When I put on sackcloth, people make sport of me. Those who sit at the gate mock me, and I am the song of drunkards. That in those laments, the psalmists position themselves with God, while the enemies are in opposition to both God and to the psalmist. Again, this portrayal by the psalmists of themselves is not just a rhetorical ploy to get God on the psalmist's side, but rather it does reflect an appropriate self-evaluation. And thus, by God intervening and delivering, the psalmists will be vindicated in their faithfulness to God. So the imprecatory petitions are also cries for vindication for the psalmist. And so in the situational context, when considered together, the enemy's wickedness and the psalmist's innocence, it means that these petitions are pleas for justice. The enemies have brought false accusations against the psalmist. The enemies have threatened the psalmist without cause. They have violated the covenant obligations of how one should treat one's neighbor. And the psalmists are suffering an injustice being perpetrated against them by the enemies. Therefore, the psalmists cry out to God to execute a just punishment against the enemies. And for justice occurs, it not only means punishment or retribution upon the enemies, but it also then means deliverance and vindication for the psalmist. So there is this whole situational context as reflected in the Psalms itself, in which we find these imprecatory petitions voiced. But the fifth context is that of the canonical context, the canonical or scriptural context. We're talking here about the inclusion in the book of Psalms of these lament psalms that contain imprecatory petitions. Now, the compilation of the Psalms was designed not as an anthology to preserve the historical record of the prayers that God's people prayed over the course of Israel's history, the purpose of compiling them into the book of Psalms was not merely to show how people had prayed in the past, but rather the compilation was designed to be the prayer book and the song book of the Old Testament worshiping community. And as such, it preserved exemplary prayers that future worshipers could pray. And it showed through these exemplary prayers how future worshipers could in fact pray, by these being model prayers. And thus, those psalms with imprecations must be viewed along with the rest of the other psalms as model prayers collected for the purpose of being subsequently used by worshipers. They serve an instructional purpose of showing how the believing community can and should pray when it finds itself in similar kinds of situations. And the purpose and function as model prayers makes it highly unlikely that sinful attitudes were intentionally preserved and canonized within the book of Psalms. And it makes it highly improbable that examples of prayers that are inappropriate or should not be prayed would be included in the collection. It would be like printing a hymnal and including songs with poor theology or even heretical theology, of including them in the hymnal and then labeling them "do not sing." So the canonical context seems to play a very significant role in how the Lament Psalms with the imprecatory petitions, how we are to understand them within an Old Testament context. So given the understanding of the imprecatory petitions in those five contexts, that of the literary context of the petitions within the Lament Psalms, that of the communication event context of prayer, that of the covenant context and all that it implies, and the situational context of the lament prayers themselves, as well as the broader canonical context. Given the understanding of the petitions in those five contexts, I do believe helps to clarify how to understand the imprecatory petitions in the Psalms themselves. Now, in part 2 of this lecture, we will summarize the purpose and function of the imprecatory petitions within the Lament Psalms. We will talk about the purpose and function of them, and then we will talk about their validity for contemporary use.